Tonight we have 7 stories, from an odd arrangement that takes a bad turn, hiking in the wilderness, other stories from the woods, and more. A huge thank you to tonight's writers. Remember to send in your story if you'd like to have it featured. Stories can be submitted at my subreddit, r/slumberreads. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Just a quick side note, the audio in this video might have a few strange noises in it, because I just moved into a camper full time. This is something I've been considering doing for a very long while, and I found a pretty nice one for pretty cheap. It has everything like a full bathroom, a full kitchen, an actual bedroom. It's actually pretty nice, and I'm really excited to be able to go out and travel. Like I said, there are a few noises, like, if the wind hits it hard enough, there's like a squeaking noise and stuff like that. Hopefully those are things that I can get figured out over time, and I hope you guys are willing to bear with me. But yeah, I'm really excited for the future, and I'm really excited to keep this channel going in the same format that it's always been done. But enough about me, let's get on to the stories. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, stay safe out there, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. So this all happened about 5 years ago. I had just turned 21 and my life was admittedly a mess. The night of my birthday I went out and got absolutely hammered, and my wasted ass decided it would be a great idea to cheat on my girlfriend with her best friend. Once word of what I did went back to her, she dumped me and kicked me out of our apartment. On top of that, she took most of our friends with her. So there I was, alone for the first time since junior high, living out of my car and feeling like a piece of crap. Probably because I was a piece of crap, which is maybe why I noticed the sign on that truck. It was printed on the back window, and I must have seen it a million times as I came into work, but this was the first time I really looked at it. It read, "Help, need kidney, type O," and then some contact info. Now I'm not all that spiritual or anything, but I realized as I read that sign that I had built up some seriously bad karma, and given that I have type O blood, maybe now was the time to do something good for once. So I gave the phone number a call. Worst case scenario, I'd change my mind and just pretend like my doctor told me I couldn't do it or something. On the other end was a very bubbly woman who seemed overjoyed that I had phoned. She explained that her husband desperately needed a transplant and that they had been trying to find a donor for months. Them and their 2 kids had been praying for someone like me to call. She even said they had set aside $2,000 for whoever was able to donate. All this made me feel great. I was helping out a family, and I was going to make some good money too. Hopefully enough to move out of my car and put an actual roof over my head. We agreed to meet up at their house and get to know each other. She explained that the actual donation process is pretty long and, obviously, giving up a kidney is a big commitment, so they wanted to make sure I was serious. I put the address in my phone, and that weekend I drove out to their place. They wanted us to meet up at 7, and because it was late October, that meant that it was going to be pretty dark by the time I set out. Following my phone's directions, I soon left the city and found myself down a series of winding country roads. By the time I reached their address, it was pitch black out. I stepped out of my car and walked to the direction of their home, only to find an empty lot. I looked around. There wasn't a house in miles. Maybe they gave me the wrong address. As I walked back to my car, I started to have an uneasy feeling, thinking that maybe this whole thing was more than I could handle. As I unlocked my car and stepped inside, I decided that when I got back into the city, I would give that bubbly woman a call and tell her I couldn't go through with it. I sat down in the driver's seat and adjusted my rearview mirror, only to catch the reflection of someone in my back seat. It's the last thing I remember. I woke up in a grimy motel bathroom, my body in absolute agony. My lower back radiated pain, and I had a splitting headache. I checked myself in the cracked mirror. There was a large stitched up incision right where my kidney had been. I slowly walked into the motel room and found my clothes folded up with my car keys and an envelope on top. I opened the envelope to find $2,000 and $100 bills and a note that simply read, "Thanks for everything." Once I composed myself, I went out to my car and drove as far away from that city as I could. Now I know that the first response is being abducted and getting your kidney stolen would be to go to the hospital or call the police, but I was just so spooked and frankly embarrassed by the whole affair that I did my best to pretend it never happened. Besides, they did pay me. Eventually I healed up, and outside of the scar on my back, I was more than happy to believe it was all a bad dream. At least until a couple days ago. You see, I've been starting to go bald, and the other day, I decided it was finally time to just shave it all off. When I looked in the mirror after all my hair was gone, I noticed something. A second scar across the entirety of my scalp. I stared at it for what seemed like an hour, a terrifying question eating at my very soul. What else did they take? My boyfriend Tyler and I live in Silver Pine Ridge, a small town at the foot of Buffalo Mountain, Colorado. It's a resort town, so between the months of June and September, it can get pretty crowded. If, like me, you're lucky enough to work in the bar of one of the only chain hotels in town, the season can be relentless. Fortunately, the benefit of living in a resort town is the very reason that people flock here in the first place. The White River National Park lies 15 miles from town. It's one of the most beautiful areas in the whole of the United States, with luscious forests, turquoise rivers, and gushing waterfalls. Tyler grew up here, and although I only moved here a couple of years ago, I've been hiking with my dad since I was a kid. So when tourists flock to Silver Pine Ridge, and our little town becomes stifling, there's nothing better than packing up a few days worth of supplies and heading out into the wilderness. Tyler suggested the hike. I'd just come in from a grueling 2 weeks at work without a break, and collapsed into an exhausted pile at the foot of our bed. He looked over and smiled in sympathy. "You look like shit," he said, and I growled and chucked a pillow at him. He laughed, dodging out of the way, grabbing my arms and planting a gentle kiss on my forehead. "Just kidding," he said. "You always look great, even if the bags under your eyes have bags of their own. But do you need a break? I already asked at work and I can take a few days vacation next week. Do you reckon you can swing it with John?" I considered this for a moment. My boss, John, was known for being a bit of a hard ass, but he liked me, and I was definitely due some time off. "No harm in asking, right?" I replied. The next week we loaded up the car with supplies and set out towards one of our favorite trails. We pulled into a parking lot about half a mile from the start, put our backpacks on, and set off. While we were walking up, Tyler pulled out his map and studied it for a moment. On shorter hikes, we stuck to the beaten path to get as much hiking time in as we could. But when we had more time, we tried to be a bit more adventurous. "So," he said, as he traced a route over the waxy paper with his fingers, "if we follow the usual route up to Bear Cove, and then take a left up through this area." I looked down at the map and nodded. "Looks good to me. We should see if we can make it there by tonight," I said, pointing at a small clearing on the map. John said it's a great camping spot, and there's a lake with a waterfall, and it's secluded. I trailed off, raising my eyebrows suggestively. Tyler grinned and looked down at his watch. "Sounds like my kind of place. And it's a reasonable distance. We'll get to Bear Cove by about 11, so I reckon we can make it there by 5 with plenty of time to explore." Having agreed our route, we set off and, as predicted, made it to Bear Cove just after 11. We took a left from there and spent the next couple of hours walking through lush, untouched wilderness. As we walked, I could feel the stress of the last couple of weeks melting off me like dirt in a hot shower. I'd almost completely wound down when Tyler's voice interrupted my calm. "Hey, look," he said, and pointed towards a clearing in the thicket. Through the dense woodland, I could see the whitewashed boards of an old farmhouse poking through the branches. "Come on, Lauren, we have to check it out," he said, turning to me, eyes gleaming. I looked back toward the old rundown building and hesitated. "I don't know, Tyler. It looks a bit..." I paused and made a face, and he grinned. "I'm here to look after you, babe. Don't worry. If any crazy, pitchfork-wielding farmers attack us, I promise I'll protect you." I hit him on the shoulder. "Great, thanks. Now you've definitely set this up for a horror film." He laughed at me, and I continued. "Luckily for me, if this was a horror film, you would definitely be killed first. So really, all I'd have to do is make sure to outrun you." He laughed, and I set my pack down on the grass. Our rule for exploring away from the path was that we would switch on the Find My iPhone function on my phone, and hide it in the bushes with our backpacks, whilst Tyler took his phone with us. It was a bit of a stupid tradition, seeing as we rarely had signal on the trail, and always made sure to let our friends know our predicted timelines anyway, but the extra security made me feel better. Tyler swung our backpacks into the bushes, grabbed my hand, and pulled me toward the house. We walked up a wooden fence that marked the perimeter of the property and hopped over it. It took us 10 minutes to walk up through the long grass of what must have been the front lawn, and the closer we got, the clearer it became that the house was long since abandoned. When we arrived at the front porch, I raised a hand and tentatively knocked on the front door. Tyler snorted and, leaning past me, tried the handle. The door swung open, creaking on old hinges, and stale air wafted from the house. I wrinkled my nose and stepped into the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, the sound hanging dead in the air. "Anybody in here?" shouted Tyler, but only silence greeted us. I smiled at him, indicating with my expression that he'd been right, and made my way further into the house. From behind me, I heard him open up one of the old wooden doors, and I pushed another open to my right. I walked into an old farmhouse kitchen that would have been picturesque had every surface not been covered in a thick layer of dust. Next to the kitchen counter was a dining table and 4 chairs with intricate patterns carved into the wood, and opposite me on the windowsill was a framed photograph. I crossed the room and picked it up, studying the photo closely. It was black and white and showed an elderly couple standing next to each other in front of the old house. I shivered, wondering why this particular picture had been left behind. There was a squeak on the floorboards behind me and I stiffened. Before I could turn around, a hand clamped over my mouth. Hot flesh muffled my screams and, in my struggle to get away, I dropped the picture and heard the glass smash as it hit the floor. The hand released me and I spun around to find a sheepish-looking Tyler and a hidden panel door connecting the kitchen to whatever room he'd been exploring. "You asshole!" I shrieked, shoving him away from me, the force pushing him back into the table. "I'm sorry, it was a joke. I didn't think you'd freak out so much. You didn't realize that if you snuck up behind me in an empty room, in a deserted house in the middle of nowhere, that I would freak out?" I said incredulously. He looked at me, and I could tell he was trying not to laugh. "Fuck you, Tyler." I stormed out of the kitchen, adrenaline and anger pounding through my veins. I walked out of the house, the front door ricocheting off the wall and slamming shut as I marched towards our backpacks. It took a few minutes for Tyler to catch up with me, and when he did, he was slightly out of breath. "Babe, slow down," he said, grabbing my hand. "Leave me alone," I said, trying to shake him off. "I really am sorry. It was just meant to be a joke." He pulled gently on my hand. I slowed down and looked at him. "Honestly, I didn't think you'd be so scared." He looked so earnest that I just shook my head at him and sighed. "Okay," I said. "I know, I believe you. And I may have overreacted slightly, but you know I have a crazy imagination." He grinned at me, looking suitably abashed, and slung his arm around my shoulder. "Well, you know what the good thing is?" he said, and I turned to look up at him. "What?" I said as we squelched through the dewy grass towards our hidden backpacks. "At least we..." He stopped as something creaked beneath us. We looked down. "Lauren?" he said, and his eyes widened in shock as the ground beneath us crumbled and gave way. I must have blacked out because when I opened my eyes, I saw a blurry version of Tyler in front of me. "Thank God," he gasped and pulled me to him. A sudden movement made my brain feel like it was sloshing against the walls of my skull. I turned my head and vomited into the dirt. Tyler tried to stand and fell back to the floor, hissing in pain. "Lauren, you have to find a way out of here," he said through gritted teeth. I shook my head wildly, sending waves of pain crashing through my brain. My vision was blurred, but as I concentrated on him, he came slowly into focus. His face was contorted in pain, and there was blood seeping out from a deep gash in his shin. I swallowed. "Lauren," he said, gently pushing my hair away from my face. "This is just going to get worse. We have to get out of here." Sunlight poured in from the hole that we'd fallen through, illuminating the cave. It was wide and almost perfectly spherical. In front of us was a sloping bank down to a pool of water, and off to the right was a tunnel leading out of the cave. Bits of grass and rotten wood littered the floor around us. and Tyler caught me looking at them. The farmers must have boarded up before leaving. His voice echoed oddly in the cave. Over the years, grass grew over it, and the wood rotted. We couldn't have known it was there. His soft tone did nothing to calm the panic simmering in the pit of my stomach. But what if they did it on purpose? I whimpered, my voice high. What if they've trapped us here? Tyler's eyes widened in surprise. My heart was pounding against my chest. Out of the corner of my eyes, something shifted in the darkness and I screamed. Tyler reached out to me, and I batted his hand away, my breath coming in harsh, irregular gasps. Tyler, I just saw something move. We have to get out of here, I said, and pushed myself to my feet. The movement set my head spinning, and I stumbled and fell against the wall of the cave. Tyler grabbed hold of me and pulled me down until I was sitting next to him. His warm arms snaked around my waist, pulling me into his chest and holding me there until my breathing evened. Lauren, this area is full of cave systems and shallow mines. You know that. His voice vibrated through the warmth of his jacket. I closed my eyes tight. I did know that. White River National Park was famous for its intricate cave systems that ran below the surface. I'd been hiking these trails for 3 years. Hell, Tyler and I had even explored some of them. I swallowed back the rising fear and tried to refocus. You're right, I said, my gaze falling back to his leg. Shit, Tyler. I know, he replied, his face serious. If I could find a way out, you know that I would, but I don't think I'll get far with this injury. I nodded again and grimaced as the pain in my head flared up. He looked at me concerned. Is your head okay? He asked. I moved my fingers to the back of my head and gingerly brushed the skin at the base of my skull. The pain was instant and sharp, and I winced. Tyler took hold of my hand and turned it around. There was blood on my fingers. Oh God, he said, his warm hands wrapping around mine. How do you feel? I shrugged, trying to keep my head as still as possible. He nodded, and we sat in silence for a few moments, the only noise the sound of water lapping gently at the bank. Okay, Tyler muttered to himself, and I looked at him. Our eyes met, and he gave me a small smile. Grasping a hand on either side of the wall, he grimaced as he pulled himself to his feet, careful to keep his weight off his injured leg. What are you doing? I whispered. One of us needs to find a way out, he said, gingerly putting some weight on his injured leg. A thin sheet of sweat broke out on his forehead as he practiced hobbling forward. His leg buckled from the strain, and he fell back against the wall. I pushed myself up to my feet. The dizziness was still there, and my head was pounding, but I could stand. I walked over to him. I'll go, I said, and he shook his head. I took his hand. You're messed up, Tyler. You can barely walk. I looped my arm around his waist and helped him lower himself down to the floor. I'm sorry, he said, and I smiled at him. It's okay. My words heavily contrasted with the churning fear in my gut. I've been caving with my dad before. I'll be okay. He smiled at me weakly. He slid his hand into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Take this, he said, and I shook my head. No, it doesn't make any sense. When I get to the surface, we might need the signal to find you. You keep it. He nodded and reached down to his belt, unclipping his flashlight from his holder. He clicked the button, and I looked away as the cavern flooded in the harsh white light. I unclipped my own flashlight and pushed the button. Nothing happened. Shit, I muttered, shaking it in the futile way that people do when they're trying to fix something electrical. It must have broken on the way down. Tyler plucked it out of my hand and pressed the cold metal cylinder of his torch into my palm. Take this one, he said. There's still some natural light in this chamber. Besides, I have the torch on my phone if I need it. I nodded at him, and the movement sent shock waves of pain through my skull. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, Tyler was studying my face, his expression grim. He held out a hand to me, and I took it. You're going to be fine, Lauren. I gave him a shaky smile. His hand gripped tighter onto mine, and he returned the smile. You can do this. I love you. I nodded at him. I love you too. He let go of my hand, and I turned away from him before he could see the fear in my eyes. I walked out of the cave, the sound of rumbling water echoing off the rocky walls. My boots slapped wetly against the floor as I made my way through the dark. As I walked, the caves began to narrow around me, and panic constricted in my chest as I came to a dead end. I shone my torch over the rocks, searching for a gap in the wall, the torchlight revealing a small opening at the base of the rocks, and the tightness in my chest loosened a little. Crouching down, I shone the light through the gap. It was small, but so was I, and the next cave was close. I had just enough space to squeeze through. I lay down on my front, clenched the torch between my teeth, and tried to shimmy my way through the opening. The fabric of my hiking jacket caught in the rocks. I hissed in frustration and ripped free from it, the slimy liquid from the floor seeping through the thin material of my thermal shirt. After several minutes of struggling, I managed to pull myself through the hole. I stood up on the other side and shone the torch around the room. The cave branched out into a network of tunnels. I walked forward, and the movement sent a lightning bolt of pain darting through my head. I stumbled and dropped the torch. I touched my fingers against my temples, the coldness of them soothing the aching heat in my skull. Gently, I crouched down and picked up the torch. From somewhere in the darkness came a low growl. I screamed and shone the light towards the noise. The bright light threw up monstrous shadows in the darkness, and I screamed again, throwing myself forward down one of the tunnels. There was a rustling of leathery wings as my movement disturbed a colony of bats, and I shrieked as they fluttered out at speed from the darkness. I ran, my hands outstretched in front of my face, following the twists and turns of the cave until I couldn't run anymore. Breathless and exhausted, I collapsed myself down behind some rocks. The light from my torch was shaking. I tried to keep it steady, but my hands were trembling too hard. I clicked it off, my teeth chattering as I tried to control my breathing. I must have blacked out again. When I came to, I was slumped on my side. My mind flooded with panic as I sat up, but subsided as I made out the torch in the darkness. I reached out to pick it up when I realized that I could see the torch there. It must be a source of natural light. Relief thawed the terror in my bones, and I stood, slipping the torch into my pocket. Using the side of the rock, I navigated through the semi-darkness. As I walked, the tunnel around me got brighter and brighter until it finally opened up into a chamber. In front of me was a muddy bank that extended 5 or 6 meters up to an opening. The bank was steep, but from my position at the edge of the tunnel, I could see grass beyond. My heart swelled in my chest, my head felt clear, and the sharp pain had morphed into a dull throbbing in the base of my skull. I approached the bank, drew a deep breath, and took a running start up the bank. I made it about halfway up before the mud beneath my feet betrayed me, and I slipped and tumbled to the bottom. My head pounded with renewed vigor as I lay dazed on the floor. I stood up and looked back cautiously into the darkness of the tunnel. I felt calmer than before, but the residual terror tapped over my skin like icy fingers. The growl that I'd heard was probably some kind of wild animal, and it was trapped down here too. It would probably be hungry. I swallowed back my fear and surveyed the bank in front of me. I needed to get out of here before it found me. The mud on the bank was thick and wet, but nettles and plants lined the surface. If they could take my weight, then maybe I could use them as aids to pull myself to the surface. I grabbed onto one of the plants and tugged. It seemed sturdy enough. I started to carefully pull myself up. My fingers stung as I reached up and grasped onto a nettle and winced, but I held on tight. At last, I was near the top. I reached out and grabbed a root. There was a deep rumbling noise from the darkness below, and as I pulled myself up, something grabbed my foot. Sheer horror ripped through me, and I shrieked in terror, pivoting around. The abrupt movement snapped the root in my hand, and I started to slide down. Panicked, I grabbed for my previous handhold, but I wrenched the roots out of the ground and tumbled down with them clutched in my hand. I landed at the bottom of the bank, terrified and covered in mud. My eyes darting around the cave, but there was nothing there. I looked up at the bank, and where I had been grabbed was a tangle of weeds that I had missed. I must have gotten my foot caught in them as I climbed. I let out a low moan of frustration as I looked at my escape route. Where I'd fallen, I'd created a landslide of mud that had covered the roots and any hope I had of trying to crawl back up. I let out another moan and put my head in my hands. I sat there for a while, rocking back and forth, and eventually stood up. I needed to get out of here. I needed to stop jumping at shadows. I thought about Tyler and the pain in his eyes as the blood seeped from the gash in his leg. I turned and walked out of the chamber. I needed to find another way out. There had to be another way out. I walked slowly, keeping my torch on and ready as I returned back into the tunnel. My left hand trailed against the cave wall as I walked. The light fell upon an opening in the side of the wall that I had missed on my way past it the first time. I shone the light towards it and saw a narrow tunnel that extended past the reach of the light. I turned to the side and edged down it carefully. As I made my way into the tunnel, the sound of rushing water amplified until I finally made it through to a high-ceilinged cavern. A fast-flowing river rushed through the center of the cave that was lit up by an opening at the top. Relief flooded through me. Snaking around the edge of the chamber was a thin ledge leading up to the exit. I walked over to it, addressing the way out. I'm not a great climber, but if I could get up onto the ledge, I'd be able to shimmy my way along it toward the exit. I reached up, and the ledge was just within touching distance. It took me a couple of jumps before I was able to get a good grip, and I managed to heave myself up onto the ledge and stand up, pushing myself back into the wall as much as I could. I started to edge along. The ledge was thinner and more slippery than I realized, and my heart pounded against my ribs as I shuffled along and ascended higher. One wrong step and I would fall, meaning broken bones at the very least. I thought about what it would mean to be paralyzed at the bottom of the chamber in the dark, and decided that maybe there was worse things than death. I was almost at the top when the ledge widened and then abruptly stopped. With both hands holding onto the wall, I peered over the ledge. I was about 10 meters up, and the gap between the ledge and the flat bank of the exit was half a meter wide. I swallowed and closed my eyes. I was going to have to jump. I took a deep breath and leaped across the gorge. On the last step, my foot slipped on the slimy scum of the ledge, and I slightly undershot the jump. For one breathless moment, I was falling. Then I managed to grab onto the ledge, but as my hands held on, I could feel the loose earth beneath my fingers begin to crumble. I gritted my teeth and willed every ounce of my remaining strength onto my aching arms. I fumbled around for something to hold on to, and my fingers found a root. I held on to it and tried to calm my breathing, determined not to make the same mistake again. I moved my right foot to touch the side of the cave and carefully began to probe the wall. When I found an indent in the side of the rock face, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding in and pulled myself upward, using both the root and the ledge for support. My arms strained as I heaved myself up onto the ledge, but I grinned through gritted teeth. I was doing it. Finally, I pulled my full body up onto the bank and collapsed onto my back, closing my eyes and letting the warmth of the dappled twilight drench my cold skin. I let out a peal of laughter and lay there for a moment, experiencing a swelling of happiness beneath my chest before rolling onto my knees and standing up. As I turned towards the entrance of the cave, a man stepped through pointing a rifle at me. "Don't move," he said. His accent was thick and strange. He was thin and old with white wispy hair curling from his scalp. I looked at him bewildered and frozen to the spot. There's a good girl. The barrel of the gun was still trained on me. What? I started and stopped as the light from the cave caught the gun, making the metal gleam menacingly. Why are you doing this? My voice quivered from the cold and fear. He shook his head and pointed with the gun towards the other side of the ledge. Stand over there. I shook my head. Please, I begged, an edge of hysteria creeping into my voice. Let me go. I'm sorry, girl, but I just can't do that. You see, I've been a keeper of this place ever since my daddy passed. God rest his soul. And it's my job to keep it happy. He paused and the rifle dipped as he peered over the edge into the darkness. I moved towards the exit and he laughed, pointing the gun back at me. I let out an involuntary whimper. Don't you go getting any ideas, girl. He motioned with the gun. And stand over there like I told you. I closed my eyes for a second and then moved to where he had pointed, the sound of the river roaring beneath me. Please let me go, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. I won't tell anyone about you or this place, I promise. He sighed. You know, we used to say that. If people made it out this far, they were free to go. He wiped one of his hands across his brow, that if they beat us fair and square, we'd let them up to the house, give them a warm bed, and send them on their way. But it's been a long time. People don't come through these parts no more, and the cave is hungry. He stepped toward me, raising the rifle to my head. Please. My voice was weak. Please don't shoot me. He gave me a sad smile. I'm not going to shoot you. My heart lifted and my expression must have changed because he shook his head slowly. I'm sorry, he said. The butt of the rifle shot out and connected with my stomach. I doubled over in pain and felt the weight of his boots on my shoulder as he nudged me backward off the ledge. My arms flailed, the air whistling in my ears as I fell. I landed with a heavy splash in the river at the base of the cave, narrowly missing the floor. I struggled in the current and emerged from the water, gasping for air. The current was strong, and I realized too late that it was pulling me towards the underwater passage by the mouth of the cavern. I took a deep breath just before I was sucked under and into the dark. I tumbled through the icy passage until my lungs began to burn in protest at the lack of oxygen. My shoulder slammed into a rocky outcrop and made a sickening crunch. I let out a gargled scream of pain, my lungs filling with water as I tried to draw back the breath that I had released. As I choked on water, my mind flooded with blind panic. I was going to drown. I was going to drown here in this fucking cave. Suddenly, my head broke the surface and I coughed violently, expelling the warm water from my chest. I gasped, swallowing thick, painful gulps of air down my windpipe and into my burning lungs. The current had subsided, and it carried me gently along as I coughed and hacked, until I bumped against a sloping bank. I blinked against the dim light, and, using my uninjured arm, clawed my way up the bank and out of the water. I rolled onto my back and closed my eyes, my chest heaving. The freezing water had soaked through my thick hiking gear, and I began to shiver in the cold. That's when I smells it, that unholy smell of iron and waste. I let out a small whimper and opened my eyes, rolling onto my side. It was in the cavern that we'd first fallen through, and in the corner under the dusky light that filtered through the hole in the ceiling sat Tyler. He was right where I'd left him. As my eyes began to adjust to the dim light, I could see the whites of his glassy eyes that stared past me, empty and motionless. His face was untouched, frozen in a mask of horror. Just below his collarbone was a mess of blood and bone, and his stomach cavity was empty. A trail of blood and flesh trailed out of the cave along the same path that I had taken just a few hours earlier. Using the last of my strength, I crawled towards him, covering my mouth to keep from screaming. I pulled myself up so that I was sat next to him on the side of the floor that wasn't drenched in blood. Tears welled up, and I swallowed back a gag as I gently dipped my hand into his pocket. My hands clasped around the cold metal of his phone and I pulled it out. 30% battery. So that's why I'm typing this warning. I know that it's now a matter of time until whatever killed Tyler comes back for me. That's if exposure doesn't get me first. I'm not sure how long it's been since we first fell down here, but I can already feel my body beginning to shut down from the cold. I don't know if anyone will ever find this, but if you're reading this, please be careful when you're hiking. Stay close to what you know. Don't stray off the beaten track. And if you come across an old, weather-beaten farmhouse about 40 minutes from Bear Cove, run. Run as fast as you can, and never look back. I was 6 months out of college with a business degree and no job. The endless amount of rejection emails was starting to take a toll on my self-esteem. The city with all the office jobs was about 30 miles from the rural town I was living in with my parents. The poverty-stricken town I grew up in was getting worse as the years passed. There was a steady flow of petty crimes throughout the year, from car thefts to convenience store stick-ups. The only means of income for someone my age was typically low-paying and manual labor-intensive. I got tired of having no money in the bank, so I decided to apply to a mattress delivery position. I landed the gig after one interview. My parents weren't thrilled at the idea, but at least it would allow me to save up some money while I continued to apply to office jobs. My father, a local car salesman, and my mother, a stay-at-home mom, were both supportive of me and longed for the day I made it into the city and out of our dump of a town. My first day delivering arrives, and I am partnered with Henry, a man who appears to be in his 50s and has no intention of retiring anytime soon. This is his career. I pray that I don't end up like him. with a sore back and sweat dripping from my body each day I return home from work. I try to keep a positive attitude, though as I step foot into the passenger side of the truck, we head out on our first delivery. "You're from around here, aren't you?" Henry says to me while he drives us to our first destination. "What gave it away?" I responded. "I can see it in your face. You won't be leaving anytime soon. This town has a way of grabbing onto you and reeling you back in just when you think you've made it out." Henry reaches into the glove box and pulls out a box cutter. He hands it to me. "Take one of these and keep it in your sock. You never know what kind of crazies you may run into on a route." "Thanks. So, where are we headed?" I reply. "A little cul-de-sac on the outskirts. We're removing one king mattress and delivering another." "Any chance of getting a tip?" I chuckle, already knowing his answer will be no. "Just stay focused and professional. In and out, and on to the next one." Henry responds. We pull into the cul-de-sac and arrive at our address. There are 4 houses surrounding the circular driveway. I notice a number of delivery trucks parked. "This is kind of weird, isn't it? Everyone getting a mattress on the same day." I say to Henry as he parks the car and turns the ignition off. "Well, I know these houses were run down and vacant for years. Looks like they fixed them up and found buyers all around the same time." Henry responds. "The neighborhood is quiet, and I don't see anyone outside. The other crews must be inside, setting up the beds or something." Henry and I approach our house. I knock on the door, and a woman opens. She welcomes us inside and brings us to the master bedroom. My gaze immediately fixates on a blood stain the size of a hand on the bottom right corner of the mattress we are removing. The woman leaves the room to give us space. "Henry, you see this?" I whisper to him and point at the stain. He ignores me and motions for us to start carrying the mattress out of the room. Together, we carry the mattress and load it into the truck. We return to the bedroom with the new mattress and place it on top of the bed frame. Henry and I return to the car to get the paperwork. "I'll stay here. Better chance at a tip with a young guy like you bringing it to her." Henry smirks and hands me the paperwork. I return to the front porch door, glance inside, and notice the woman standing in the kitchen, a little bit past the living room. She tells me to come in. "Here you go. Just need a signature here on the bottom." I hand her the paper and a pen. "Would you like some lemonade? It's freshly squeezed," she says. "No thank you, but thanks for the offer," I reply. She signs and hands me the paperwork. When I return to the truck, Henry is nowhere to be found. I have no clue where he has wandered off to, so I knock on the woman's front door to see if she might know. "Hey, sorry to bother you again. Do you happen to know where my coworker went?" I ask her. "Oh, as a matter of fact, I do. He's in the backyard sipping on some delicious homemade lemonade. Hard to resist on a sweltering day like today. Why don't you come on back and have a glass?" Henry must have walked around the house to the backyard. There must be someone else this woman lives with who invited him over from out back. I follow the woman and step outside. I don't see Henry. Something crashes against the back of my head. I drop to the ground and pass out. When I awake, the brightness of the sun is almost blinding. I quickly realize that I am tied up to a mattress. My mouth is covered with tape, and my chest is bound by rope. I turn my head to the left and right. There appear to be mattresses on both sides of me, as well as below me. Every mattress has someone tied to it. It looks like we are out in the middle of the street. I lift my head up and see Henry on the mattress in front of me. I can hear a woman's voice start to approach from behind me. It sounds like the woman who offered me lemonade. Another voice from the left, another from the right, and one more near the base of my feet. I look around and see 4 women surrounding the mattresses. They are all wearing black dresses. I try to slither out of the rope, but I'm unable to get any traction. I pause my efforts to see what the women are doing. The 4 of them raise their hands in the air and look up at the sky. "We bring you an offering. Take them and set us free," the woman behind me says. The 4 women focus their attention on Henry. As he starts to squirm, the women's eyes turn marble white. My heart starts pounding as Henry's mattress floats up in the air towards the sky. As Henry vanishes, one of the women collapses to the ground. When she stands back up, I notice her eyes are back to normal. The other 3 women rush up to her and hug her. "You see, it really works. Only 3 more to go," one of them says. I hear a car approaching from down the road. I look up as it pulls near us. I can see a dealership sticker on the window. It must be my dad going on a test drive with someone. The women turn their attention towards the car as it pulls up next to us. My dad steps out of the passenger side. "Tyler, is that you?" he shouts. I nod yes to the best of my ability. As the women slowly walk towards my dad, I'm able to reach just far enough into my sock to grab the box cutter. I cut myself loose and cut the ropes for the other two men. The women are inches from my dad now, so he hops back into the car and the driver starts backing the car up slowly. The women turn their attention back on the two men and I. As they walk towards us, the three women with white eyes are plucked from the ground and launched into the sky, slowly fading away from our sight. Their shrieks are overwhelming even as I cover my ears. A few seconds pass and the sound is gone. I look at the one remaining woman. I'm sorry. She continues to say as tears run down her cheeks. My dad yells out the window, pleading for us to hop in the car. The two men and I hop in the back seat as the car drives down the road, creating a bit of separation from the one remaining woman. My dad tells me the cops are on their way. We sit in the car and watch the woman who has not moved. The cops eventually arrive and arrest her. A year passes and I hear that the woman still has not said anything to the cops about what went down that day. I of course decided to quit my mattress delivery job immediately. I joined my father at the dealership and got some selling experience. With that experience, I was recently able to land a software sales job in the city. And for Henry, well, nobody in town seems to believe me when I tell them what I saw with my own eyes. Deep down, I feel like Henry saved my life that day, and for that, I am grateful. As far as getting a good night's sleep after experiencing the events of that morning, I've made it a habit of sleeping on a couch instead of a mattress. It just feels right. I don't know if I have a medical condition, but I oftentimes will wake up at 3 a.m., knowing that I will not be able to go back to bed. Oftentimes I take advantage of the restlessness, and I will go for a walk to get my miles in. I live close to a trail that was once a railroad system. The old railway system that is now a trail connects over 100 miles throughout the Philadelphia suburbs. I ventured outside and was delighted there was a bright moonlight, since the daylight hadn't emerged yet. The part of the trail I was on surrounded by trees, and a river with no houses in sight. Of course, there is typically no one else on the trail this early in the morning. I continued to walk my typical route and I eventually saw a figure of a person come closer to my direction. Being that I'm a taller male, I'm apprehensive but not overly scared. I try my best to not make eye contact to not engage this person. However, I glanced over and noticed he was a boy not older than 14. He seemed like he was a little bit lost, or a little bit frightened. Because he was virtually a kid, I couldn't ignore him. I said, "Are you alright?" He said, "I want to go home." He was wearing a white t-shirt with old Levi jeans. In Pennsylvania there are Amish, Mennonite, suburbanites, Philadelphians, farmers. So it's not always easy telling someone's class or money worth just by looking at them. This kid definitely didn't seem like he came from a wealthy suburban development. He had a crew-cut haircut and didn't have the same edginess that most 14-year-olds develop. He eventually responded to me, "I just want to go home." I asked him where he lived and he told me he had just walked miles from his parents' house and now he was heading to his uncle's house. I said, "Why didn't you just stay at your parents' house?" He responded that, "They can't feed me, they have no money. My mother gave me biscuits and told me I had to leave." I was shocked on many different levels. What a terrible thing for a kid to have to deal with. Why didn't his parents have food stamps? How can you throw out your own young son? I didn't want to leave this kid without knowing he was going somewhere safe. I inquired about his uncle's house. The boy told me he couldn't go to the 7th grade because he had to work on his uncle's horse farm. He said that he had to work all day, mostly tending horses in exchange for food. Once again, I'm perplexed. I didn't know the child labor laws, but it definitely didn't seem right. He pointed where he was going. It was a trail through the woods, which he said led to his uncle's farm. I know the trail, but I don't know every piece of land in the area. I also know that most of the farms were sold off years ago, when farmers learned they could sell their land for a small fortune for what is now coined urban sprawl. The boy continued through the woods, and I felt really depressed hearing the plight of the young boy. I continued towards home. Now the sun is starting to emerge with a thick layer of fog emerging. Once again, another figure of a person emerges. This time it's a young man in his later teens. I really don't want to engage him. I just want to go home, but he looks completely lost. You never know what someone's angle is, but he looked genuinely lost. Like the young boy, He appeared different as well. Very simple, almost like he's never seen an R-rated movie. He told me he was walking for hours trying to get to the train. I thought to myself, why is he here? The trains here are long gone. The tracks don't even exist. The closest train is about 15 miles away. I explained this to him. He replied he must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. I then asked what direction he came from, and he pointed north. Again, I think to myself there's not a train for about 40 miles. There hasn't been one since they ripped the tracks out years ago. I asked, where did you need to go? And he said that he was on leave from the army and had to get back. He said he finished his training in his company battalion and was headed to Europe. Well, I said, that's a much better place than Syria or Afghanistan. He looked at me like he had never heard of those places. I told him it would take about a 6-hour walk to get to the closest exiting train, and he continued in that direction. At this point, I'm completely perplexed. Of all the years I've been walking, nearly no one ever stops to talk, and here I had probably the 2 strangest encounters that I've ever engaged in. Eventually, I got home. My wife and kids woke up. My wife was focusing on getting ready for work, and was only half listening to me. Later in the day, I met up with my grandmother, and explained the 2 individuals that I met on the trail. As I continue to tell her what I encountered, she starts to cry. I'm now baffled why she's crying. Then she says, "That was your grandfather." I said, "What?" She said during the Depression he had to leave his house because his parents had no money, and later on he went to Europe for the war. My grandfather died over 20 years ago. I went back on the trail and retraced my steps and followed the path the boy took through the woods. I then approached a suburban housing development. I say to myself it's possible the boy walked through this development, but I really can't imagine a farm being close to this area. To this day I'm left wondering, who were the 2 individuals I met on the trail? I should have asked them more questions. I've never seen them again. As a child, my friend Alec and I used to explore the woods on my property nearly every day. We would wander deep into the forest just seeing what we could find, play hide and seek, or sometimes just to hang out with nature. This continued into our late teens when we brought our group of friends out to camp overnight. We started off our hike around 1900 and walked around 2 miles into the forest until we found the perfect spot to set up camp. A wide open clearing, close to dusk. Alec started to unpack and set up the tent while the other 4 of us set off to find suitable firewood among the tall trees. By the time we had gathered enough wood and made it back to camp, the sun had almost sunk completely below the horizon. I had the responsibility of building the fire, which I had done within about 15 minutes. Once camp was complete, we were sitting around the fire chatting and roasting marshmallows for s'mores, when Justin brought over the cooler of beer and liquor his dad had bought for him. We had taken several shots, and were working on a beer when we decided to tell campfire stories. This went on until around 0200, when we drunkenly stumbled to the tent to call it a night. I woke up with a start when I heard a cackling out in the woods, which had scared me to my core. I shook Alec awake and asked if he heard it too, and he did. About this time, the others had woken up from our talking, and I could see the concern growing on their faces, confirming they all heard it as well. "Who's out there?" Justin called out. The only response was the abrupt end of the laughter, which unsettled all of us. We were all wide awake and too spooked to go back to sleep, so we decided to get up to rekindle the fire from earlier that night. Upon exiting the tent, we saw that the campsite had been destroyed aside from the fire, which had a small dead mouse laying right by it. I had poked the rodent with a twig and turned it over to reveal a precise incision on its belly, with its innards hanging out. "Bro, what the hell?" exclaimed Josh. Right as he had completed his sentence, I heard something moving through the leaves just outside of the clearing. Startled, my eyes shot up towards the sound, but I couldn't see anything. Brandon went back to the tent to grab his small flashlight and shine it out into the trees. The only thing we could see was a set of glowing eyes looking directly at us. The unknown creature quickly stepped behind the nearest tree, attempting to avoid detection. Justin slowly walked towards the creature, trying to better see what it was, until he disappeared out of sight. Less than a minute went by before we heard his screams, but as quickly as it began, it had ended. We tried calling out to him, but he didn't respond. We all sat around the fire waiting for his return, but he still wasn't back when the sun came up. When Justin still hadn't been found, we all set out to look for him, hoping he'd gotten away from the whatever had taken him. After about 45 minutes of looking, I heard Brandon yelling for the rest of us to come help him. When I got there, Justin was hanging from a tree by his wrists, his body covered in shallow, precise cuts. Josh climbed into the tree with a knife, while we supported Justin when he cut him down. He was still breathing, thankfully. We splashed some cold water on his face, and he woke up with a scream. We were able to help him walk out of the forest back to my house, where we got him into the car to go to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, we asked him what the hell happened, and he said as soon as he got out of the clearing, he saw an animal walking on all fours, but very quickly it got onto his hind legs and ran towards him impossibly fast. But that's all he could remember. I honestly don't know how to begin, other than the fact that I am still alive, I think. I suppose, at the beginning, when life took its first turn. With it being 2020 now, I feel I need to explain some things. This particular incident took place in 1983 when I was 8 years old in rural, very rural, Missouri. Nearest population center had 128 people. Now the town is closer to 200, but is nearly a ghost town. You see, in this era, snatchers were just a scary story from the cities. My home life wasn't very peaceful, so me disappearing on my own for hours at an end wasn't unusual. So long as I was back before dark, I could go and do what I wanted. By the ripe age of 8, I knew my way around the backwoods, road, and fields fairly well. To get it straight, this isn't some story of a kid getting lost and barely escaping some mysterious cryptid. You must also keep in mind the culture and type of folk that I grew up around. Old superstitions and wise tales were held as gospel still. Everything from a turkey drowning in the rain to predicting the weather. So I grew up on stories of the critters that lived in the natural places. Hoop snakes and Tommy gotchas, well children and the hungry catfish. So many stories I've forgotten more than I remember now. Mama telling me about the evil eye and how our bloodline had the weird in it. Her daddy had it, and her mama was a herb woman. Everyone has heard of the Appalachians and the people there, the hill folk and backwoods people. Not everyone knows that the Ozarks has the same. Our hills and valleys still hold families that have been there longer than any can remember, that are there and living as they always have even in this year. I know I sound like I'm starting to ramble, but believe that this knowledge is going to help understanding later on. And if this is read by enough, I may continue on with another tale of life. Then again, I don't really believe many to read this, let alone take it serious. Folks are always saying that there is more to life than the human mind can fathom, and I for one agree. See, there is a whole lot that normal people just simply ignore because to actually acknowledge it would be to admit that reality is so much more. It would be admitting how little control we have in this existence. How could an 8-year-old know of these things, though? So for me, it was just another day in late spring. Stay out of the local pastures. The bulls were getting mean. Snakes were out and about. Make sure the stick was just a stick. Otherwise, exploration was my youth, for the most part. I avoided my home as much as possible for details that aren't any of matter, which left me to really wander the countryside. Yes, many things could have happened, but didn't. I always just felt safe, watched over. Up until this point, I just felt it was because of my dog, a black and white mutt named Roscoe. Up until that point, I thought that, like you, the stories were just stories. See, it was getting toward evening and I had stumbled on a big old flat stone run smooth by hundreds of seasons of rainwater washing along a creek, and it was grown over with moss. Ever lay down on a bed of moss? It's soft and comfortable. With warm sun, it is easy to lose track of nearly everything, which is what happened. I knew I wasn't going to make it back home by dark when I came to my senses, and that mutt wasn't any help as he was snoring next to me. With the shadows growing longer and the sun sinking quickly, taking its gold/red glow with it, I started hot stepping back. Now this was old growth woods at the time, underbrush and brambles and thorn bushes aplenty. I knew my way, even in the dark, and my night vision was excellent, so navigation wasn't a problem. Nor was I scared of the dark, the animals, or the sounds. Yet at some point, I somehow got turned around, running straight up on the one thing in those woods that scared me more than what was waiting at home. There was an old cabin, probably left from a hunter or a trapper, and it was in bad shape. I mean, the shack in Evil Dead was in better shape. I would never hesitate before about exploring such a place because of the thought of what I could find, but this place was just a squatting toad of nope. Half the roof caved in, the walls were missing in parts, and the wood was that black type of slow rotting. This place just felt wrong and gives me the shivers now just writing about it. I was turning to leave that forsaken place when I caught the flicker of movement from inside. My first thought being that it was just an owl or a raccoon. I looked back. Whatever was inside was much larger and moving toward a surviving window frame on the side of the ruin. Every bit of me was screaming to run, but I just had to see, to know. A shape came flying out the window, landing near enough to me that I could see what it was. On the ground was the head of a bull. I tried to run, but a fog began to fill my head, making me dizzy as all hell, and I didn't know up from down. I stopped trying to move and saw a shape come out of that place. Not ashamed to admit, I pissed myself as I least managed to turn around. A skeletal hand reached over my shoulder and grabbing my chin tilted my head back. That grip was cold, to the soul cold, and a vice had nothing on the strength. Nails or claws or talons to this day, I don't know what tipped the fingers, just know they were sharp. Sharper than my dad's old straight razor. Every muscle felt held in place, and I could feel this thing's presence. I refused to open my eyes. I didn't want to see it. Bad enough I felt its touch. It was close. Closer to me than you are to this screen right now, when it inhaled my scent, deeply as if trying to judge the way you would smell a rose, or test the wine cork. Then it spoke. By all there is, that was the worst part. Have you ever been in a real, natural cave? Not one of those with the guided tours, but one out in the middle of nowhere? The air gets chilly once you are in far enough, and there is a wet smell to it. Minerals and soil too. It doesn't smell bad or good, but it is a unique smell. That is what the breath smelled like. Damp earth and stone and age. It only said 2 words. Just 2 before it was gone in a rush of branches and shadow, leaving me in a state of terror and confusion with a cut on my chin deep enough I still have a scar. I still hear the echoes of those hissed syllables. Not tonight. I was legally dead for 5 minutes. The expectation of the afterlife is not what you think. There was no bright light. I didn't see any dead relatives or friends. And I sure as hell didn't see God. Who knows? Maybe it's different for everyone, or they fabricated what they saw to block out what they actually experienced. I only felt pain for half a minute before I was able to open my eyes. I was suspended in darkness. There was a heavy pressure on my chest, and there was nothing. Not a single person, object, or sound. It was completely silent. I couldn't even hear my own thoughts. I tried to say something, but not a single sound came out. When I opened my mouth, I noticed small bubbles of air had escaped my mouth and floated upwards. I was submerged in water, yet I didn't sink or float. Confused and frightened, something in the distance slowly sank. I watched as the object continued to sink further and further into the dark abyss, while another floated upwards. Do you know where you are? The voice was loud and clear inside my head. I felt my head throb and ache. You are in limbo. This is not heaven nor hell. This is a place for those who are lost or refuse to let go. The water around me shifted as something circled around me. I tried to say something but had the same results as before. Why do you refuse to let go? Death can relieve you of everything. Doesn't that sound great? I shook my head vigorously. I didn't want to let go because of my family. They needed me. Is that what you think? The voice chuckled darkly. I felt something caress my ankle. They refused to let go. Now look at them. I looked down to see a pale hand around my ankle. More hands reached out from the darkness and grasped onto me. They're getting impatient. The water shifted again as the thing moved to face me. I was shocked to see a featureless blob of black goo. Its tendrils moved lazily in the water. Does my appearance disappoint you? A tendril snaked around my arm as another touched my face. The coldness made me flinch back. The thing laughed and retracted its tendrils. Let's get this over with. I have more souls waiting for me. With a flick of its tendrils, A body floated up from the darkness. I stared wide-eyed at the small little girl in front of me, her face void of any emotions, her skin pale, and her body looked more skeletal than flesh. This poor soul lost her life, a grueling battle with what you would call cancer. The mask moved around the child's frame. It then turned towards me. She's been here for a very long time. I believe it's time for her to leave. Only you can do that for her. The little girl's head perked up with the words leave. A spark of life ignited in her dull eyes. She looked at me with a look of plead. For the last minute and a half, I felt something other than fear and confusion. A strong jab of guilt. The thing chuckled and placed a slimy tendril onto my shoulder. It leaned down and spoke into my ear. If you stay, she can be reborn. If you choose to return to your old life, she'll have to remain here until I decide to let her leave. Tears began to run down the girl's face. Her eyes closed shut as she let out a silent wail of pain and longing. She looked to be no more than 11. I've practically lived my life while she hardly started to live hers. I was torn. My heart ached for the girl, but yet it yearned to go back to my life, to my family. I was about to agree when the water started to churn. I felt a sudden sense of doom and terror. Somewhere below us, an animalistic roar shook me along with the sudden strong current of water. There were screams and wails of terror and pain. I watched as desperate faces emerged from the darkness, their arms outstretched as they tried to grasp on anything to pull themselves up further in the waters. But something kept them from getting any closer. A large, webbed hand clasped around them and dragged them back down. Another one was grabbed. I watched in horror as a massive head appeared, 2 large yellow eyes, a mouth fitted with rows upon rows of teeth, and gills on the sides of its monstrous head. It looked at us and let out another deafening shriek before it shredded the person in its grasp. Blood along with chunks of flesh and organs floated up towards us. We basically bathed in the gore before the water settled, and they floated back down. I thought it was over, and the water churned again. This time a single beam of light shone down on us. The being before me growled and swiftly returned to the darkness. The place seemed to shake as large pieces of rock and debris sunk past us. The little girl looked horrified as the massive hand snatched her and dragged her back to the bottom, her face frozen in a silent scream. This isn't over. The being hissed and quickly swam away. Then the world fell around me. I woke up in the hospital. My body ached and was covered in bandages and gauze. I had a very long recovery from the plane crash. I had to learn how to walk with a prosthetic. I also had to learn to ignore the pale figures that seemed to watch me from a distance, their eyes full of longing as they yearned to take my life and start anew. I don't think it's over. I had dreams about that place, and each time it got harder and harder to escape. Sooner or later, I won't be able to escape and I'll be stuck in limbo forever. I haven't slept for 3 days. The pale figures have gotten closer, and that thing's voice keeps calling my name.
Number 1. The house. There was a house that my family lived in for about a year, when I was a teenager, that I really didn't like. At first, I really didn't know what it was that bothered me about it. However, from the beginning, there was something about the house that rubbed me the wrong way. I was sort of scared being alone in that house to a degree. It was not a terrifying feeling, though, and I didn't try to avoid being in the house alone. Especially when my father and stepmom would go to visit relatives and I didn't have to go with them. However, on those days, my dad would have a whole lot of beer, and when he did that, he would always overstay his welcome and not get back until really, really late. And that was okay with me. This was in the late 1980s. I was 14 years old, and we lived in a beautiful house. It had a full-size but unfinished basement, but it was a bit dark and freaky down there because it was completely underground. The walls were cinder blocks. There were a lot of boxes and some old furniture down there. There was nothing really scary in there, but there was just something about it. I wasn't really scared of the dark, but there was something about being down there when I was by myself that I didn't like. I always felt like there was someone or something watching me from behind the furniture. But the worst part was going up the stairs. It was a wooden staircase that creaked. I always wanted to run up the stairs because I felt something was behind me and wanted to chase me. But it was worse because I also thought that a hand would reach up from between one of the boards of the steps and grab my ankle as I ran up. The only reason any of that is important to the story, though, is to give you some idea of what it was like to live in that house. It was also sitting on top of a hill, on a ridge, in a huge yard. At night, you would always know someone was driving toward the house, because you would be able to see it atop one of the other hills, before it descended, and then ascended, up the several hills that it had to, in order to get to the house. I wasn't the only person who was scared of that basement either. My sister, who was 5 years younger than I was, could be absolutely terrified of it. But also, being a 9-year-old at the time, she had a much more active imagination and belief in scary things. She was more specific about what she thought was going after her in the basement, though, than I was. She insisted it was an old witch who lived down there and hid behind the stairs and the furniture. It was a pretty chilling thought. But despite the fact that the house could be very creepy sometimes, I did like living there. And being 14, I enjoyed the time that I could spend in the house alone. I found myself rarely going to visit relatives and often remaining home by myself. And it was late on a summer night when I had the scariest experience ever in that house. I was sitting in the living room. Our couch was against the back wall, and the TV was parallel from the wall. To the left of the couch was a very large picture window. That was from where you would be able to see down the driveway and able to see other cars driving on the hills towards you. It was about 1 or 2 in the morning. I was watching TV with the lights off. I think the show was Freddy's Nightmares, an anthology horror show that was hosted by the character Freddy Krueger. It wasn't really that scary, but I enjoyed watching it, mostly for Robert Englund. I never knew when my parents would get home, but whenever I noticed a set of headlights out of the corner of my eye, I instinctively turned my head and looked out the big picture window. I don't remember what the show was about, but I was watching it pretty intently. And then, there was a flash of light outside at a distance, and I assumed it was a car, so I quickly turned my head to see if it was my parents' car. Now, this happened really quickly. As I turned my head to the left, I noticed a dark shadow in the dark corner to the left of the TV. It barely registered as I was trying to see if the car was coming. However, whatever that light was, it was definitely not my parents' car. But as the realization hit me that it was not the car, what I had seen in the corner next to the TV also registered with me. My head jerked back to the right to look directly in that corner. And although it was dark, I saw an old, scraggly woman standing in the corner. She was wearing a black dress. She had long, unkempt gray hair. She was holding her hands together in a ball in front of her, and the worst part was that she was looking directly at me. Startled, I jumped into a crouched position on the couch, my feet underneath me. I quickly scanned my eyes across the room, looking to see if there was anyone else other than the old woman in the room. I quickly noticed that there wasn't, and I returned my gaze to the corner that she had been standing in, and when I did, she was no longer there. I wasn't sure how to react. For who knows how long, I remained on the couch, Still with my feet on the cushions, my eyes scanned everywhere in the room and the hallway again, wondering if the woman had quickly darted somewhere. However, I cannot figure out how she would have done that. Part of me wanted to go run and turn the lights on, while the other didn't want to move from the couch. I backed myself into a corner on the couch, and I kept watching TV. We didn't have a remote-controlled TV back then, so I didn't get up to change the channels. I simply remained on the couch waiting until my parents got home. I couldn't get the picture of that woman out of my head though. Although seeing her was scary, it wasn't the scariest part. The scariest part was realizing that the scraggly old woman looked like a witch, and remembering that my sister had always claimed to see a witch in the basement, hiding behind the stairs and the furniture. Number 2. The Well. I've always approached matters of the supernatural from a very specific viewpoint. I don't believe people are lying to me when they tell me about encounters that they have had. There are many things that can be explained as supernatural seeming, but really aren't. So I tend to believe the stories, but not that they are otherworldly in any way. If there was objective proof that something supernatural occurred, I would take that proof at face value at the time that it was presented. I just felt I needed to get that out of the way. This story appears to be supernatural in nature, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it is, and there could be other explanations for what had happened to me. This happened when I was a teenager, and it was the first time that I was left home alone in a new house. We had moved into the neighborhood about 6 months before this took place. I was 15 at the time. I had switched schools in the middle of the school year, so I really hadn't had any time to make new friends, but I was fine with that. My family went off to visit relatives. I didn't go. I don't recall exactly why I didn't go, only that it was my choice not to. I wouldn't claim that our house was out in the country. It was out of town, but not really in a very rural setting. We did have a well in our backyard, or actually it was more like a lot. It was a large field behind our house, but it was supposedly part of the property. There was an old-timey looking well in that field, just like you see in a cartoon or horror movie. I'm not the type of person who scares very easily, so I wasn't worried at all at being home by myself for a few days. And while I was at home, I spent most of my time in the darkened living room watching stuff on television. On the third night I was in the house, I was staying up late and watching something on late night television. It was nothing out of the usual. I definitely remember that it was nothing scary, so my imagination hadn't been worked up. Around 2 in the morning, I went to let our dog out into the backyard. There was also nothing unusual about that. The dog went around, did what it had to do, and then came back to the house. I gave her a treat, which was customary, and then went to close the door. "Bradley!" I thought I heard a voice whispering my name behind me as I turned back into the house. It was very eerie and caused me to turn around. It had seemed like someone had whispered it right in my ear, but when I whirled around, nothing was out there. The light was on in the backyard. I scanned the yard, as far as the light would allow me to do. Other than the back porch light, however, there was no other light source out there. There was not even a moon out that night, and I didn't see anyone out there. I got one of those chills. I'm sure you know the ones I'm talking about. It is involuntary, and it begins in your spine until a shiver just racks your entire body. But it is also over nearly as quickly as it begins. So I turned and went back to walk into the house again. "Bradley!" I heard the voice whisper in my ear again. This time, I jumped and quickly turned back to look behind me. Just as before, my eyes scanned everywhere in the backyard. While the first time I heard the whisper, I could have written it off as my imagination. I knew that this time I had heard it for sure. After once again not seeing anything or anyone out in the yard, I turned once again to go back into the house. However, this time, I was a lot less comfortable than I was the first time. I went into the house quickly, locked the screen door, shut the back door, and then both locked and bolted that door. I stood there for a moment and realized the kitchen window, which was facing the backyard, was opened. So I went to close it, and when I leaned over to push the window closed, I heard it a third time. "Bradley," as a whisper. I shut the window quickly and locked it. I turned on the lights in the kitchen, in the hallway, in the living room, and everywhere in the house that I would be going. I had heard someone whispering my name 3 times. The only comfort I had was that each time it had come from outside of the house, so I felt good locking myself in. I tried to go back to the TV and do my best to relax. It wasn't easy at first, and every time I thought I had noticed something out of the corner of my eye, out of one of the windows, I found myself jumping and paranoid. It took a long time before I was relaxed enough that I was able to concentrate on anything else. I don't think that I was able to fully relax at any point during the night, although I did my best to try to. I eventually fell asleep on the couch in the living room while I was watching something on TV, but my sleep was not the calmest. The following day, I decided that in the light of day, I should go out and look around in the backyard, in the field behind it. I didn't really like going out in the field because it was not mowed or kept in any way. There was a lot of brush, briars, and thorns, but for some reason I felt that in order to be as thorough as I could, that I should really look back through it too. When I saw the well, which was boarded up on the top, I felt a strange and very foreboding feeling. Yeah, that could have had something to do with the prominent place wells have in scary stories. It could have just been because it was a crumbling relic from the past. I don't know, but it made me feel very uneasy. I turned to go ahead and walk back to the house. As I turned with my back to the well, I heard it one last time. I had a voice whisper, "Bradley," in my ear behind me. I simply ran, faster than I had ever ran before. I got into my house and locked myself in, and anything else got locked out. Well, I have no idea if what happened was related to that well. I never went back to it again. I never heard that whisper again. I have never heard any stories about the well, such as a child dying in it, or anything like that. All I know is what I heard that day, and that was enough to keep me away from it. Number 3. Giggles. I was walking home from a friend's house when I was younger, when I had a very scary experience. This was in the summer, and plus it was during the daytime as well. We lived far out on a rural route in the hills, so far out that it took like a 90-minute bus drive from home to school and back again. Most of the kids in the school didn't live out in the country like we did. They lived in town. So the bus that came and got us never had a whole lot of children in it. Furthermore, the houses out there were not very close together. My buddy Joey was the closest friend I had, and even getting to his place was quite the trek. Occasionally, we would get one of our parents to take us to the other's house, but more often than not, we would walk to the other's house. During the summertime, because we would spend the night at each other's house, and also because we were off school and our parents were at work, we would very often have to walk to the other's house in order to do anything. The previous night, I had stayed the night at Joey's house. We had played some video games and watched some scary movies. You know, the typical thing that 13-year-old boys like to do. But I knew the next day both of my parents would be at work, so I had to get home around 1 p.m. at the very latest in order to check on our dog. It was a clear and very bright day. I was walking along the gravel road. There were ditches dug on both sides of the road, and beyond the ditches, varied amounts of trees and bushes and such. At some points it was very easy to see out into the hills, but at other times, any view was blocked by the branches. It was a hot summer day. I heard the strangest noise as I was walking. I was used to all the sounds of the country, and I had lived out there all my life. This sounded like a human giggling loudly, though. Although there was some animals out there who could make human-like noises, this was not one that I had heard before. This absolutely sounded like there was someone in the woods giggling. It caused me to stop for a moment and look around. I couldn't tell exactly where it had come from, just up in the woods someplace. I started walking again, and then suddenly I felt something hit me in the back of the head. It smarted pretty bad, and I reached up to feel my head where I'd gotten hit. Looking at my hand, there was a little bit of blood on my hand, but only a really small bit. I assumed whatever hit me had been a rock, but there was so much gravel on the road, I didn't try to look for it. I started walking again, and then once again I heard that weird giggling coming from out in the forest somewhere. I only stopped for a moment, looking around at the surroundings and wondering just what was going on that afternoon. As I began walking, I once again felt something hit me in the back of the head. This time the pain was a lot sharper, and I almost stumbled over when it happened. Distressed, I looked around, hoping to see where the hit had come from. This time, by looking on the ground, I saw a piece of gravel with a little bit of blood on it, and then I immediately guessed it had to be my blood. I went to pick up the rock and look at it. As I was holding it, I heard the giggling sound for a third time. It was too much at that point. It was just very creepy, and I had no idea what was going on, so I just dropped the rock and began running up the hill. I ran all the way until I was at the driveway to our house. At that point, I was getting cramps running too hard, and I had to slow down. But I was still scared, and I wanted to get inside before I heard that giggling again. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. I hope everyone had a good holiday season. If you don't celebrate the holidays, I'm hoping that you still had a nice couple of weeks. I'm going to be doing some different things this upcoming year, but it should all be good. I'm going to try to work out a schedule for videos to be released on, which I should have done a long time ago, and I'm going to add more videos and types of videos going forward. Once I have it all figured out better, I will put up a video updating you. Maybe tell me about content you want to see. Please subscribe and share the video if you haven't already, and send me any original stories if you have them. But as usual, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.